Jews around the world are experiencing an unprecedented surge of anti-Semitism that has grown into an epidemic of delegitimization and even deadly violence. Many despair of finding a way to deal with this terrible problem or have internalized the vile slanders of their foes to the point where they are unable or unwilling to fight back. What they need is a lesson on how to defeat the Jew haters from one of the most important contemporary thinkers and writers in the Jewish world. Next, on Think Twice, we talk to JNS columnist and author Melanie Phillips about her important new book, Fighting the Hate, a handbook for Jews under siege. Hello, and welcome to Think Twice. Faced with anti-Semitism on a scale that is unprecedented in living memory, many, if not most Jews, including those who lead organizations dedicated to defending their community, are baffled. Nothing in their personal experiences or the recent history of Jewish life in Western countries has prepared them for not merely the large-scale efforts to delegitimize the State of Israel and mainstream blood libels about its people and their supporters elsewhere, but the way these lies are mixed in with all the traditional tropes of Jew hatred have been accepted by the mainstream media, academia, and popular culture as not merely falling within the Overton window of acceptable discourse, but as accepted truth. They feel helpless when confronted by the way the Jew haters have captured the language with which these issues are discussed, and intimidated by the dilemma of being marked as not merely the member of a group that is despised, but which is falsely labeled as a bunch of white oppressors, and therefore deemed unpopular and unfashionable by elite opinion. But the answer to this problem is not to give up. Jews don't merely need to wake up and fight back, but to do so effectively and win. And fortunately, there's a newly published handbook that can instruct us how to do it by one of the most important and clear-headed thinkers about politics and culture around today. And we're very happy to have her back with us today on Think Twice. Melanie Phillips is a journalist, broadcaster, and author who has championed traditional values in the culture war for more than 3 decades. She writes a weekly column in the Times of London, as well as for JNS, and regularly broadcasts on the BBC. Her previous books include her 2006 bestseller Londonistan, the 2010 The World Turned Upside Down, The Global Battle Over God, Truth, and Power, her 2013 personal and political memoir Guardian Angel, the 2025 The Builder's Stone, How Jews and Christians Built the West and Why Only They Can Save It, and now her latest, Fighting the Hate, a handbook for Jews under siege. Melanie Phillips, welcome back to Think Twice.
Hi, Jonathan. Good to see you again.
Well, Melanie, thanks so much for taking the time to join us today. I think you've written a really important and useful new book, but I want to start by asking you, who is this book for, and why is the current struggle facing the Jews different from those in the past?
The book is for mainly Jews in the diaspora in America, Britain, Australia, other countries, and it arose out of trips that I made to particularly Australia, America, and Britain last year to promote my previous book, The Builder's Stone. And I was talking to Jewish communities, and I found in all these countries, Jewish communities absolutely beside themselves with shock and distress and confusion and bewilderment about the tsunami of hatred and irrationality they were finding, not just in the things that people were saying about Israel's war in Gaza. That was bad enough because it was basically lies and absurd fictions that were coming out as Hamas propaganda and being promulgated by mainstream media. But much worse than that, they were being accused themselves of being complicit in what was deemed to be happening in Gaza. The Jewish people were being held collectively responsible, and they were bewildered by this, especially in Australia, where they had felt so comfortable in their Australian skin. It's a country which until October 6, 2023, had no problem in accepting Jews just as regular Australians. And suddenly, almost overnight, they became enemies of humanity. And they all said the same thing to me. What should we do? What should I do when faced with this? What can we do? Is there anything we can do against anti-Semitism? We know anti-Semitism is irrational. We know anti-Semitism will always be with us. Is it hopeless? And I thought about this a great deal, and I thought two things. First of all, it seemed to me that clearly this was a species of anti-Semitism, the oldest hatred. Yes, we had been here many times before in our history, collective history, but this was different. This was a situation in which there was a concerted attempt being made to do a kind of it was I think led by the Islamic world, which on October the 7th, 2023, when the Hamas-led Palestinian Arabs in Gaza committed those atrocities in Israel, a kind of ecstasy emerged immediately in the Islamic world. They felt that their time had come finally to destroy Israel, finally to destroy the Jews, and finally they would be then on their way to destroying the West. And that mood made itself known on the streets of cities such as London and New York and elsewhere in these terrible demonstrations that we saw. And it seemed to me that unlike anti-Semitism of the past, and this is absolutely not to disparage what happened in the past, particularly, the Holocaust, genocides, and before that, mass exterminations of Jews. But this was something different. This was a kind of global, concerted, organized, global onslaught against the entire Jewish world. And the appalling thing was that it was not simply coming from fanatical Islamists. It was being supported to the hilt by people who purported to be rational and to be liberal and to be people of conscience in the West. And that confluence and the dangers that it posed to Jews across the world seemed to me unique, unprecedented. And I thought there are things that can be done. Nevertheless, there are things that must be done. Jews have an absolute duty to stand up against lies, against injustice, and to tell the truth. And also, in addition to that, it seemed to me that there was much that could be done if people had the right ideas about how best to go about this. And I thought, and I still think, that the organized Jewish world in the diaspora didn't really have a strategy at all. So I set about trying to help provide one.
Thanks for tuning in to Think Twice. Whether you're listening to us on any of the podcast platforms or watching us live on Facebook or X or on the JNS YouTube channel, please like and or subscribe to JNS, click on the bell for notifications, and give us good reviews. Also, in addition to Think Twice, there is a Jonathan Tobin Daily podcast where I share more news and analysis with you about the most significant issues we're facing today. You can find The Daily Show under Jonathan Tobin Daily on the JNS channel, wherever you get your podcasts. And now, back to today's program. I guess the question, is why are so many Jews, as you say, especially those living in the United States, Canada, Britain, Australia, so ill-equipped to deal with this crisis? It's, as you say, it's not as if, we've never encountered anti-Semitism. It's not as if, Israel hasn't been an issue, something about which there has been debate. What caught everybody as if they'd never heard of this issue before, as if this was a whole new world? Why was this so different?
First of all, it was different in that if you scroll back to the Nazi period, and, we all know we should not equate this with the Nazi period. But if you go back to the Nazi period, that was a state apparatus organized to destroy the Jewish people. And that was something against which the Jews of the time had virtually no way of resisting, apart from in small pockets. This is not like that. This is something that is coming at people through institutions that they thought they were part of. The democratic democratic elected politicians, political parties, the cultural world in which they have played a very significant part. The arts, literature, theatre, movies, particularly the education system, universities, schools, all those things, the professions. This is a world in which diaspora Jews have inhabited without even really thinking about it. Okay, there was always anti-Jewish feeling, but it was on the fringes. Now, they were part of this world, and then they couldn't really deal with it because they have never been, in the diaspora, Jews have never been used to what I would call fighting a robust fight on behalf of the people of Israel. They have protested from time to time very volubly and in some ways quite effectively against particular outbreaks of anti-Jewish feeling. But they have not thought of themselves in terms of a Jewish people that needs to stand up for Jewish peoplehood. On the contrary, diaspora Jews, particularly in Britain, which of course I know best, but I think also in America, have been very nervous about being seen to distinguish themselves from the surrounding culture, being seen to be different in any way. They have felt their security lies in being the same. Mm-hmm. And to keep the differences very much private in terms of religious observance, and insofar as they're not private, to be kept at a very light level, light cultural level, which everybody can kind of share in, matters of Jewish food and Jewish expressions, that kind of thing, which don't threaten anybody. What they've never done is to think of themselves as a people, and a people whose identity is formed by Judaism, which is not an add-on, but Judaism is the inseparable fusion of the people, the religion, and the land. Now, diaspora Jews have been very, very frightened about thinking that because they're not living in the land, and they don't want people to think that they have a loyalty to the land. Now, I'm not saying for a moment that you have to live in Israel or be an observant Jew to be a Jew. You can be a Jew, obviously, if you are none of those things. But if the Jewish people are being attacked on the basis of their entitlement to the land, then if they're up against a situation in which the underlying narrative is to say you're not entitled to that land, you are not entitled to be in that land, that is not just anti-Zionism, that is actually an attack on Judaism itself. And diaspora Jews have never thought of it in that way. And consequently, for this and other reasons, they've always played defense. So classically, in the last 2.5 terrible years, when people have come at us, come at the Jewish community and said, you're committing genocide in Gaza. So the reaction of most diaspora Jews to say, that's the most ridiculous and terrible thing to say. How can you say that? We are the victims and the targets of genocide. We are simply defending ourselves against it. Now, that is all absolutely true, but once you start arguing on the ground laid down by your opponents, you've had it. You might as well not bother because you're effectively being asked to answer the question, when did you stop beating your wife? In other words, these are unanswerable questions. And so instead of, and this is what I've said in my book, instead of playing defense, the Jewish world, the Jewish diaspora has to get off the back foot onto the front foot, and it has to play offensive, by which I don't mean being offensive. I don't mean being rude or disobliging or discourteous. On the contrary, we should always be very reasoned. But by being on the offense, on the front foot, I mean actually putting stuff into the public domain which people don't want to hear. They don't know about it. They don't want to hear about it. It puts them at a disadvantage. It identifies on, it gets them on their own ground, where they feel vulnerable. And many of them are very vulnerable. They're very vulnerable. If you're a person of the left, for example, you believe that you stand for all good things. You stand for moral virtue, you stand for conscience, you stand for compassion, because You're a person of the left because you believe in the betterment of humanity and all those sorts of things. You're against abuses of power. You're against racism. You're against ethnic cleansing. So one weapon at our disposal, which the Jewish community doesn't use, is to hang upon their necks the very thing that they most hate, to accuse them truly and genuinely of being the very thing they hate, because they are. And the Jewish world doesn't think like that, because it never thinks on the front foot. It's always on the back foot. It's always, don't hurt me. I'm a victim already. Mm-hmm. Why are you hurting me? And that's the way you lose. It's I'm afraid that's a doctrine for losers. That's the way the Jewish diaspora has always been. That's what's got to change.
In line with that, you write about one of the real obstacles to taking the offense is doubt. Why is doubt about the justice of Israel's cause, which I think is, is quite apparent, and the evil that its enemies espouse, so hard for diaspora Jews to shake off?
Well, to a large extent, I'm afraid it's because most diaspora Jews don't know a great deal. I mean, and I have to, plead guilty to this. Until very recently, I knew very much less than I do now. It's quite a shock to realize how little I knew. Many, if not most, diaspora Jews rely to a very large extent for knowledge about the Middle East, about Israel, about Palestinian Arabs, about the Islamic world. They rely on what they're told by the mainstream media and by what's being taught in the universities. The general consensus. And the general consensus is simply wrong for all kinds of reasons, but it just doesn't tell the truth, and it tells lies instead. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that a lot of the Jewish world just doesn't know enough to know that what they're hearing is lies. So I can't... I've lost count of the number of times people said to me during the Gaza war, what's happening is absolutely terrible. This anti-Semitism is coming at us everywhere. We're hearing all these dreadful things, these ridiculous fabrications over and over again about killing babies, about genocide, about ethnic cleansing. It's terrible. And then they said to me very quietly, but do you think there's anything in it? And, you sit back and you think, how can you think that? You just said how awful and ridiculous this is. So why are they thinking that? Well, because they're looking at the TV, they're seeing the images, and we all, people all saw those images of, the skeletal children and so on. And people like you and me know that those images of skeletal children were lies, because those children, unfortunately, were dying of terrible diseases, not of famine induced by Israel's behavior in Gaza. But people who are not following all this closely will look at those images, and they will look at those images in the context of what they're hearing from the mainstream media, what they're reading, which is Israel is wantonly killing the innocent. And it goes in. And so with one part of them, they think it can't be true. On the other part, they think, well, maybe it is. I mean, would everybody be saying this if it wasn't true? And this is a real killer. And I agree, if I didn't know anything, I would probably think the same thing. Is it really possible that the entire mainstream media, that all the university teachers, that all the cultural icons of our culture, and the United Nations, which stands for peace and justice, and all the associated international tribunals, the International Criminal Court, the International Court of Justice, and the big NGOs which stand for conscience, War on Want, Oxfam, Save the Children, is it possible that they are all wrong and only Israel is right? And crazy as it sounds, the answer is yes. And of course, it sounds ridiculous. And so ordinary Jews, faced with this, they feel that they not only they can't stand up to it, but they're not sure. Is it possible, they ask themselves all the time, is it possible that we are right and that everybody is wrong? And the answer is yes, not least because it is not everybody who is wrong, because there are millions and millions of people out there who are not Jews, who are sane, and decent and grounded and sensible, and they can see what's what, and they know perfectly well about the lies that are being told. They also find it incredible, but they are able to see that they are lies. And there are a lot of people like that out there, because they write to me in great number and I can hear it. So we're not actually alone, but we feel, as a Jewish people, we feel in the diaspora, we feel very alone. And so doubt, as I said in the book, doubt is a killer. Because if you as the Jewish community, you as the Jewish person in the diaspora, doesn't really wholly believe in what you are saying, you can't make the argument.
I think the key question for many Jews, whether collectively as students at colleges or anyone when confronted in daily life with open delegitimization and hate for Jews, is what to do. Do you engage or simply ignore it? Or even worse, shelter in place when they find themselves under attack, as so sadly so many Jewish leaders often advise. How do we navigate that question?
Well, again, I have tried to address this in the book, and it's not a question that to which an easy or uniform answer can be provided. First of all, much depends on the circumstances, and secondly, much depends on the individual Jew. There are some Jews who are very robust in their character. They're up for a fight. They like to engage. They like to debate. They like to argue. They have confidence.
But not everybody is you and me.
Well, I'm really a blushing violet, as you know. But there are others who are very timid, and for whom this is just not on to engage. And so there's that. And then there's the different circumstances. What's coming at us is coming at us from different kinds of people in different kinds of situations. So, for example, there are people of the left, there are people of the right, from whom it may be coming. There are people who are ideologically so programmed to hate Israel and Jews that you can't possibly get anywhere with them. There are others who are simply well-meaning but ignorant and have been taken in and are quite prepared to listen. There are others who are well-meaning and ignorant and not prepared to listen. There are family, there are friends, there are business colleagues, there are fellow students or fellow academics on campus. All these people are coming, and also there are Jews who are hostile to Israel and have a very conflicted sense of their own Jewish identity. And there are Jews on the progressive side of politics, a side which lends itself now pretty well universally to disdain or hatred of Israel. But Jews on that side of politics who either are doubling down because they can't bear to admit that their whole philosophy of life is going up in smoke in the terrible scenes of October 7, 2023. And there are other progressive Jews who on October 7, 2023 said, "Oh my goodness, I have to rethink," but find it very difficult to rethink. And so all these people are coming at us from very different situations, different circumstances, and are speaking to us, and we're all different in ourselves. So what I said in the book is that you have to work out where it's coming from and what kind of person you are. No expectation on anybody to stand up and fight. And the most important thing is to keep yourself physically safe. I mean, that must come before anything else. But the people who decide not to stand up at all against all this, very understandable. But I've spoken to a number of these people as well, and they've said, "I've regretted it ever since." There is something in the Jewish person which says, if I don't stand up for my people at such a time, then I have fallen down on my duty and responsibility. And that's not a nice place to be either. So the advice is to find a way of achieving some sort of equilibrium, that you do enough to make you feel that you've done something at least, even if it's something terribly small. You've got to feel you've made some kind of difference. But there are other people for whom, just pitch in. It all depends on the circumstance.
Yeah. Why is it so hard for so many Jews, let alone other people, to understand that you can't oppose anti-Semitism while also being anti-Zionist or just attacking Israel and even supporting the claims that it is committing genocide. Why is it so hard to get this lesson across?
Well, yes, it's because it's generally accepted that there is a difference between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. Now, in principle, that is true. Anti-Zionism is against the state of Israel, or against the desire, or against the right of the Jews to have their national homeland in the state of in Israel as a state. And there is anti-Semitism, which is against classically Jews as people, or against Judaism as a religion. I'm thinking of medieval Christianity, which was anti-Semitic because it was against Jews as a religion, and of course racial anti-Semitism, which surfaced in Nazi Germany, against Jews as individuals. I'm very sympathetic to the idea that trying to kind of say that anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism is almost irrelevant, because anti-Zionism should be considered a bad thing in itself. To single out Israel as the country alone, the only country in the world which is treated in this way, with falsehoods, with demonization, with delegitimization, with mass libels, with an obsession with all these things, that is in itself inexcusable and terrible and a form of prejudice and bigotry against Israel as a country. And I agree with that, and I think that there is much that the Jewish world could be doing by attacking or opposing anti-Zionism per se, without going into the whole anti-Semitism thing. But of course, anti-Semitism, carries a moral opprobrium which opposing a country doesn't have. And I think it is correct to say that anti-Semitism is expressed by anti-Zionism for two reasons. First of all, what I've just said, which is the way in which Israel is treated, is to single it out alone among all the countries in the world for treatment afforded to no other country. And that in the unique characteristics of that attack on Israel, those unique characteristics happen to be precisely the same unique characteristics that distinguish anti-Semitism from any other kind of prejudice. This is not a coincidence. It's because one thing is the other. And the last point, however, which is something which I think I don't see generally talked about, which I believe very strongly, is this, that Judaism is, as I've just said, the fusion of the people, the religion, and the land. You can't separate them out without destroying Judaism. If you're an anti-Zionist, you believe that the Jews don't have the right to their own historic homeland. You are not simply singling out the state of Israel. You are not simply singling out the political philosophy of Zionism, which grew up in the late 19th century. You are attacking Judaism itself, because Judaism is meaningless unless it is understood to be the ancient faith of a people who believed they were divinely ordained to live a particular life with particular rules and laws in a particular land. You can't understand Judaism unless you understand that. And so the attack on Israel is, or an attack on Zionism is necessarily an attack on Judaism. Why is it so difficult to be able to understand? Well, most people have never met a Jew in the Western world. I mean, most people in Britain have never met a Jew in their lives. And they know nothing about Judaism, nothing about the Middle East, nothing about the history of the Jews in the Middle East, nothing at all. What they think is that Judaism is a religion rather like Christianity, as a kind of private dialogue between the individual and the Almighty. The idea that Judaism is this complicated thing of the people whose faith is based in the land, they have no idea about that whatsoever. And I'm afraid a lot of Jews don't realize that either. So it is very difficult to make this argument unless one actually tries to educate the world into what Judaism is and into what Jews are. And again, the Jewish community has never made really any attempt at that at all. The only thing it's told the world about Jews or Judaism is, I'm afraid, about dead Jews. It's made a fetish, I'm afraid to say, of the Holocaust. And that's what most people associate Judaism with, dead Jews.
Yeah. You write about the need to reclaim the language with which this debate is being conducted. But why is the subject so hard? In a time of unprecedented surge of anti-Semitism, not helping to combat this plague, what's wrong with using the term anti-Semitism, whatever its origins or limitations?
I've hesitated to use the word anti-Semitism, although having said that, I use it a very great deal because it's very hard to think of a
we need the word to
synonym.
Describe what we're talking about. Yeah.
Yes. But I've hesitated because for decades now, I have felt a terrible frisson whenever I've used it. I'm talking now about the early 1980s. In fact, I felt so strongly about it, I wrote a whole play about it, about the difficulty of using this word. Because there's a resentment in the non-Jewish world. The resentment itself is anti-Semitic, but that doesn't help you because they resent the whole idea of anti-Semitism. They resent the idea that the Jewish people purport to be the victims of a hatred or hostility so enormous that it dwarfs all other hostilities. They feel it's unfair. I've heard it said, the trouble with anti-Semitism is that you suck all the victimhood out of the world and use it for yourselves. I mean, this is like completely lunatic, but it's a very commonly held belief. And underneath all that, when you excavate it, they think that anti-Semitism enables the Jews to get away with it. What is the it that anti-Semitism enables the Jews to get away with? Well, it's all the things that we know about the Jews. That they all stick together, they look after their own interests, they don't care about anybody else, they believe themselves to be superior to us, they want to dominate us, they run everything for their own benefit, they run all the things that hurt us, the exploitation of capital, the exploitation of progressive ideas, both simultaneously. These are the things that we know about the Jews. The Jews collectively are this tremendously bad force, and it affects our lives, and we can't talk about it because we're told we're anti-Semites. And now, in addition, if we criticize Israel, we're told we're anti-Semites. Well, of course, that's not true. If only they would just criticize Israel. They don't criticize Israel. They demonize it in a way that they don't behave towards any other people, country, or cause. But that's how they feel. They feel resentful. And so I hesitate to use the word anti-Semitism because I'm aware that it's immediately a minefield. So what do? You can talk about hatred of Jews, but even hatred. I mean, everybody now knows that hate is a bad thing, and everybody knows that if you are a certain protected minority, then anybody who dislikes you is a hater. And so you can't criticize those protected minorities. So the word hate has been hijacked. The word words like justice have been turned inside out. Social justice is actually social injustice. It means, that the claims of certain approved groups must take precedence over those groups that are not approved, and so on. So language, and it doesn't just apply to this whole area of anti-Jewish feeling and anti-Israel feeling. It applies really across the board in which, progressive ideologies have reframed everything. So, for example, if you say to certain people, the idea of white guilt or white privilege, because the West is colonialist in origin and white people have to do penance for their privilege and expiate their guilt. All white people. If you say to people promoting this ideology, that is racism, they laugh at you. They laugh at you because you can't be a non-white racist. White people are powerful and privileged, goes the thinking. And if you're powerful and privileged, you can never be a victim. You are only the victimizer. So black-skinned and brown-skinned people can never be guilty of racism. So the word racism, in fact, racism itself is a twisted version of racialist, but put that linguistic detail to one side. Racism has been hijacked to mean only anti-black or anti-brown feeling. You cannot be a racist if you're anti-white. So immediately you've hijacked the language. You've destroyed the very meaning of what racial prejudice is.
I think ignorance about the reality of the Middle East, or why the Jew haters are mobilizing right now, is endemic. But we're constantly told, I know I am, by those who critique advocacy for Israel and the Jews, not to give people who accept the blood libels and the myths of Hamas propaganda history lessons. How can we correct an obvious education gap about the essentials without turning people off, especially the young who have, shall we say, short attention spans due to their screen addictions? Is there a way of schooling ordinary people about the myths and facts about the conflict and how Jew hatred works in a way that they can relate to?
I think it's very hard if the products of such prejudicial diseducation, de-education, are coming at you individually. I do try and do this in the book. I try and give people the tools by which they can make at least something of an impact on people coming at them in this way. But basically, you can't actually address this at root. As an individual, it can only be addressed at a social, cultural level, for which you first of all need the thing to be called out by the Jewish community, which with certain notable and noble exceptions, it doesn't do. It doesn't say, for example, that as a general community, diaspora community, it doesn't say, for example, that school children and university students are being taught the lie that Israel is in illegal occupation of the so-called occupied territories. Now, the Jewish community doesn't ever say that for various reasons, one of which is it doesn't actually think in those terms about the need to address education at root. Secondly, it's timid and all those things. But most profoundly, so many diaspora Jews themselves believe that Israel is in illegal occupation. So it comes back to what we were talking about earlier, this business of doubt. If you don't actually know the facts, you can't address the untruths. If you don't know the truths, you can't address the untruths. But basically, what needs to happen is that governments need to have their feet held to the fire and be told they are presiding over a culture which is inciting murderous hatred through lies. And you've got to basically get rid of the lies before you can put in the truths. So you can possibly do the same, could do the two simultaneously. But the truths you should put in is information about Judaism and about what it is, and about its history and the history of Jews in the land of Israel. And again, I mean, forget the non-Jewish world for a moment. I don't think the vast majority of Jews coming through the education system, even one as stellar as it is in America, in the sense that so many Jewish children go to Jewish schools, unlike in Britain. Even in America, I have found that so many graduates of Jewish schools, they may know a very great deal about the interstices of Jewish religious practice, Jewish culture in very many ways, and they know a lot about the Holocaust. They know virtually nothing about Jewish ethics. They know virtually nothing about Jewish history in the land. They know virtually nothing about the history of pre-Israel Palestine, why it was called Palestine, what Palestine actually means, where the Arabs who are now claiming to be the indigenous people of that land actually came from, that the vast majority were immigrants who came from neighboring Arab countries on the back of the returning Jews because they correctly perceived there would be jobs and money and opportunities. That's indeed what happened. They know virtually nothing about any of this, and they know nothing about the way in which the contribution that Judaism made to the core ethics principles of the West. That, you know, the contribution that Jews and Judaism made to the greatness of the West. They're not taught, in other words, to be proud, to be knowledgeably proud of the Jewish people. And that's the Jews. So if you don't have a diaspora Jewish community that knows, understands, appreciates, and loves what it is, then how can you expect anyone else to do that? So all these things have to be addressed, if not simultaneously in sequence, but a start has to be made.
Yeah, you note that one of the primary obstacles to many Jews speaking up and fighting back against the contemporary Jew haters is the fear of being labeled right-wing in a culture in which not being liberal or left-wing is considered beyond the pale. What's the answer for people who identify support for Israel, Zionism, and assertive Jewish identity as a whole as somehow politically toxic and even culturally toxic?
Yes, well, I know about that because, as I've written many times, I myself thought that for a long time when I used to work with The Guardian newspaper a long time ago. I consider myself to be part of the liberal left. And I know how people like that think, that, you know, you assume that you stand for all good things, as I've said before. You know, you stand for conscience and compassion and justice and standing up against abuses of power and so on. And consequently, anyone who dissents from that is not just wrong, but evil, because they stand for all bad things in the world. So how do you get over that? Well, you can't easily get over it. But what you can do, and what I've said in the book, is, you know, scale down your expectations. Don't expect that the liberal progressive who thinks that the Israel Defense Forces are killing babies out of wanton brutality, don't expect them, as a result of speaking to you, to say, oh, now I get it, they're the most moral army in the history of the world. Don't expect that. All you can expect to do is to open their minds a crack, and you have to find ways of doing that. And I've given some hopefully useful guidance for that. But in general, again, what I think one needs to do is, okay, if you're up against a left-wing person who, you know, is, you know, he's wrapped in the keffiyeh, he's wearing a green bandana out of sympathy with the Hamas and all that. Okay, so that kind of person you probably best avoided. But assuming he's not that kind of person, you can actually, I think you can allow yourself, and you must allow yourself to realize that where that progressive liberal person is coming from is not necessarily a bad place at all. They're coming from a position of idealism. They want to do good in the world. They want to stand up for the oppressed. They want to stand up for justice. They want to stand up against abuses of power. They want to stand up for law. The problem is that they think Israel on the wrong side of all those things. And so I think all you can do in those circumstances as an individual is to show them that something isn't quite right about that cartoonish view of the world, that life is more complicated. So you can ask them or suggest to them ways in which they hold two apparently contradictory thoughts in their head at the same time. you can say, I do agree with you that Itamar Ben-Gvir and Bezalel Smotrich are dreadful people. I agree with you, and I agree with you. It's terrible they're in the coalition, and I agree with you that Netanyahu has kept them there because he has, he wants to stay in power. That's all absolutely. I agree with you. But have you thought that it doesn't follow that what Netanyahu's been doing in Gaza is therefore anything other than would have been done by any other Israeli prime minister? Because look at these facts. You can have that kind of conversation with some people, and you hope that it might make them realize life is actually quite complicated. You see, the left-wing universe is a bit like the Islamist universe. It's Manichaean, by which I mean it divides the world into absolutes, good and evil, black and white. And you're either on one side or the other, and you can't cross over. Well, life's not like that. We're all, as human beings, complicated individuals. We're all very, very able, and most of us do, hold completely contradictory positions at the same time. Not because we are incoherent, or some of us might be, but because life is contradictory. You can actually think that, two or three things which seem to be in opposition to each other are simultaneously true. And with some people, you can actually prise this open if they are what I've called, I think I've called them liberals with moral vertigo. They have they were kind of so stunned on October 7, 2023, by the people that they had thought were being oppressed by the Israelis, turned into barbaric, psychopathic slaughterers for which there was absolutely no reasonable excuse. And they can't process it. But they want to, they're feeling their way. And with those kinds of people, you can, I think, make some headway. But the first thing is you have to park your anger, park your distress, understand that they're not necessarily bad people. Understand that they are coming possibly from a very good place. Treat them with respect. Treat their views with respect. Just try to nudge them a little to open it a little bit of a crack.
I think another sort of interesting angle on this problem is not necessarily even those Jews who are sort of on the other side, but those who do care about Israel, do care about Jewish life, but are, shall we say, too addicted to a view of Jewish life and history that is, as they say, a lachrymose vision of our past and present, to sort of pull themselves together in a coherent or effective manner. I know I had an interesting experience just last week when I was giving a speech, and I was trying to sort of rouse that community to get themselves together and to realize they're not alone, and they can fight and they can win, and that we're not all doomed. And there were some, or at least one in particular, afterwards, who a member of the audience came to me and she thought it was impossibly optimistic to think that Jews could possibly, win or possibly survive. Is this part of our problem too?
Absolutely. It's not really surprising. But it's a kind of Stockholm syndrome. You sort of take on the impression of you that the enemy has. But I mean, for goodness sake, I don't need to tell you, but by all standards, Israel shouldn't be able to survive. Surrounded by 1.8 billion Muslims, most of whom want to destroy Israel, and yet it's becoming the power in the region. And having had this shattering experience of October 7. And the Jewish people has survived through persecution, annihilation, genocide, and assimilation, any of which could and has felled other cultures. And yet the Jews have survived. So, our whole history is to buck the trend of logic from that point of view. I fully understand. If you're brought up I mean, Jews are lachrymose. The diaspora Jews are lachrymose. I mean, this is the point when I'm speaking to you from Jerusalem. In Israel, they're not lachrymose.
Mhm.
They're not lachrymose at all. They have other less endearing characteristics. An inability to agree or be civil, for example. But they're not lachrymose. They are energized by optimism because they know what they are here. There is no doubt about it. And everybody is together. Everybody is united in fighting for their existence. Why? Not simply because they want to live. That's enough rationale, you might think. But because they want Israel to survive and they want to have Jewish children and Jewish grandchildren in order to perpetuate Israel's existence. Why? Because they love it. They love what Judaism is. They love their history. They love their principles. They believe in it. They believe in these principles. They believe that they're the best way to live. They don't all live up to them, of course. But there is a sense of collective communal pride and optimism that comes from really understanding what they are and admiring what they are. And I'm afraid in the diaspora, that just doesn't exist. They don't even know what it is. And so they fixate for, I'm afraid to say, I know this sounds awful, but I believe it to be too true. They fixate for moral virtue on dead Jews who are beyond criticism. The martyrs of the Holocaust. They're beyond criticism. And consequently, by wrapping themselves in that mantle, they feel they're being protected. Now, that is very foolish. First of all, it's not very nice. But secondly, it's foolish because clearly it hasn't worked. It's gone completely belly up. But it's hard, I think, for Jews in the diaspora to have this joyous sense of what they are. Some do. In fact, quite a lot do, but an awful lot don't. And it really holds Jews back. You can't adequately defend yourself as an individual, as a Jewish individual, or your community, if you don't wholeheartedly engage with and love what that is. And you can't wholeheartedly engage and love what it is if you don't know what it is.
Yeah. Now, one element of this that I know both of us have written about is the question of Jewish leadership in the diaspora. Jewish leadership has, I think, largely failed this crisis. But how can communities come to grips with those in positions of responsibility who simply don't know what time it is with respect to the current situation and are just dealing with the, shall we say, the playbook of past generations?
Well, Israel has that problem in a different kind of way. How do you deal with the fact that Israel is still led by a whole class of individuals in politics, in security, in the higher echelons of the army, who were responsible for October 7, responsible for allowing Israel to experience October 7, and they're all still there. Well, they're not all still there. Some of them have resigned, but a lot of them are still there. How do ordinary people change their leadership? Well, they've got to start jumping up and down. They've got to start using the levers that they have, whatever they are, by election, by funding, whatever they are. I mean, they're different, I think, in America from Britain.
The thing is, I'll just interject here. Israelis will have an opportunity to change their leadership later this year at some point because there will be an election. They won't necessarily be able to, oust the people in the military and various other elements of the Jewish establishment, but they will elect a government. Jews in the diaspora, I mean, leadership is purely voluntary and it's based on money and, sort of other things. We're in a different position.
Yeah, well, I think, I'm very cheered. I can only really speak about Britain. I don't really know enough about the interstices of American community Jewish leadership. But in Britain, I'm very cheered by the fact that the younger generation, people, broadly in their 40s or lower or younger, are quite different from the older generation. They are much more aligned with what I've been talking about. And but unfortunately, they're not running the show. And what's happening in Britain is that the established leadership, the Board of Deputies, Jewish Leadership Council, I mean, some of them have very impressive individuals working for them and on their councils. I don't wish to demean anyone in those institutions, but collectively they are a joke, and they're regarded by successive governments as a joke. I mean, you talk about American Jewish leaders not really stepping up to the plate in the last couple of years. That is absolutely the case with the British Jewish leadership. But increasingly, the cultural weather is being made by the younger people who are engaging in a proper way. They're the people who are increasingly being invited on to, radio and TV shows, insofar as those mainstream radio and TV shows ever have people who are sympathetic to the Jewish cause, which is not very often in Britain, frankly. But nevertheless, they are pushing their way through. And they're making the older generation appear as irrelevant and useless as they are. So those younger people have somehow got to seize the reins in some way, either by establishing alternative institutions which can effectively challenge the status quo institutions, or by rising within the status quo institutions, which is less likely because institutional inertia means that it's very hard to break through. I think it's much more feasible to start one's own outfit and then challenge it from outside. But somehow or other, that's really the only way through this if you're going to have an effective community leadership.
Yeah, you write in your book, and I think it is vital to remember, that Jews in the West are not alone. I think that's definitely true in the United States. But one of the problems is that most of the traditional allies of the Jewish community have betrayed them since October 7th, if not long before that. Is it really possible to make new alliances with people who have good reason not to betray the Jews? How should Jewish communities approach also the question of interfaith dialogue at a time when so many of those who Jews encounter in such efforts are actively engaged in spreading Jew hatred?
Yeah, well, interfaith dialogue has been long been a bogeyman of mine because it's like the peace process. It's institutionally set up not to fail, and consequently you can't have in interfaith dialogue anything that might divide you. So it's ludicrous. You never actually ever engage with things that actually should be engaged with. Nevertheless, it is absolutely possible, I think, to make alliances across faiths. There are people in all faiths, including Islam, who are not many, but possibly more than we think, who would come on board in the right sort of circumstances. Certainly there are many Christians who are kind of not at war with, but are very separated from, disenchanted with their leadership. I'm thinking particularly of the Church of England, where there are a lot of Anglicans, members of the Church of England, who are horrified by the terrible, theologically based hostility, hatred of Jews, let alone Israel, within the higher echelons of the Church of England. That's its particular tragedy. And then there are others. I mean, black churches in Britain are often very, very sympathetic to Israel because, Africa is very sympathetic, generally speaking. There are obviously differences, but nevertheless. And Sikhs and Hindus, no problem at all. They are our natural allies. And so there is a lot that can be done. But you see, Jews are getting much more muscular about this. Again, diaspora Jews have never really seen the need to make alliances. So they do interfaith work. And that's kind of thought to be enough. We have nice discussions. We invite our Christian and Muslim colleagues on the Interfaith Committee for a Shabbat meal.
Yeah, well, they see it as a value in and of itself, and not necessarily as a way to sort of help combat and help deal with the problems of the Jewish community.
But I say in the book, and I've said elsewhere, that one obvious thing for Jews, the diaspora, to do and they sort of Jews of Israel, is to make common cause with Christians to fight the evil of Islam in Africa and the developing world. I mean, there are innumerable, appalling atrocities going on all the time. Christians being burned alive in churches, Christian women being multiply raped, raped by many Christian women being raped, Christians being forced to convert to Islam at the point of a sword, all that. Not a peep from the church. Not from the churches. They are silent for various reasons: fear, appeasement, ignorance, or whatever. Now, the Jews should be making common cause with those Christians who are so appalled by what's happening to fight this publicly, to be seen to be fighting it publicly, to join shoulder to shoulder against the common enemy. Unfortunately, so many Jews are frightened to be seen to be opposing Islam because they've been told by their cultural leaders, who are generally progressive, in the Jewish community, that Islamophobia is to be regarded as the same as anti-Semitism. And consequently, the Jewish community has been paralyzed in the sense that it can't even speak about Islamic anti-Semitism, which is, to put it mildly, disproportionate in the Islamic world. But this is an obvious way in which alliances can be made. And there are many other alliances like that. If you start thinking in this way, then a lot of opportunities open up. And yes, you can make a difference.
I think we both know that at the heart of this problem is a biased mainstream legacy media that has normalized and spread tropes and language of Jew hatred and anti-Zionism. But do you think the liberal media can be fixed? I mean, just to boil it down, trying to correct their mistakes seems to me, a quixotic endeavor these days because they're just ideological. Is there a way to fix them, or do we just have to replace them?
Well, the mainstream media is simply the public face of the intelligentsia, based on the universities. That's where the corruption is. And that corruption is deep-rooted. It's been the case for, really since the Second World War ended, that the academy, the universities were progressively colonized by the idea that the West was founded in the original sins of colonialism and imperialism and racism and whiteness and all that, and that the Jews were on the wrong side of that. And, how many generations are we on from then? 2, 3, 4, whatever it is. And so we have a an intellectual class which has been not taught any alternative to that. And the media come out of that. So we cannot expect the media to change at all until and unless the culture itself changes at its very root, in the very belly of the beast, which is the universities. Now, can that be done? It's a very tall order. How do you turn around a culture? Very, very hard. But a start can be made. So much of this is driven by, it's a bit OTOs, a bit idle to call it peer pressure, but it's basically how this works is, everybody looks to everybody else. And if the consensus says, Israel is an aggressor and a rogue state, and if everybody is saying that, well, then you can't go against it. So you have to puncture that. You have to make it so that it's no longer the consensus. There's actually an alternative point of view. And then you start to break that consensus. It's a very slow process. And you have to find ingenious ways of breaking it. Not least, again, America is very different from Britain in terms of its university funding structure, its university corporate structure. But there's a great deal that can be done by people like in America who are the funders of universities, who keep the universities going because of the money they give. And in Britain, there's a great deal that could be done, if it was so minded, by government and its agencies in simply calling it out, in saying it is unacceptable. It is unacceptable. And we have a right to say that. It's unacceptable to have universities which don't allow freedom of speech, for example, for conservatives. It's unacceptable to have universities which are teaching Islamist propaganda to children, to children and young people. It's unacceptable to have schools which are teaching Islamist propaganda to their students. Now, we don't have any of that in Britain. I mean, there's nobody in government that says that. On the contrary, they all basically, their only concern in Britain, I'm afraid, under this government in particular, but not just under this government, under previous governments too, but it's worse now, their only concern is to protect Muslims and the Islamic world from criticism at all. So even more difficult is it now in Britain to call out properly Islamic Muslim anti-Semitism and the driving hatred of Israel that is in the Islamic world. Is becoming even more difficult to talk about that. Now, I don't think that's quite the same in America, but I'm not aware that many people are actually doing that. But maybe increasingly they will. But that's the way you do it. You have to use all the bully pulpits that are available. And there are many. We just don't think of them because they're never used, and they're never used because of the kind of circular argument that the people who are the prominent people in our culture in different areas, whether it's politics, whether it's the church, whether it's the arts, whether it's universities, they all think the wrong thing. So you can't break it. So you have to have people who will come from the outside of that and will find ways of breaking it. You can make a start. You can make a big start. And once you make the start, once people who don't know what they don't know that they're being told lies, once people start hearing an alternative discourse, they must say to themselves, is that true?
Mm.
Why haven't I heard that before? Is that true? Is what that person is saying is true? And then you have the beginning of an argument. And once you have an argument, then the whole thing levers open. You've got to start having the argument. Bring that about.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. I think certainly, we've made some progress on that in the United States with President Trump's efforts to pressure colleges. And certainly in terms of the media, there are alternatives, which is what we're doing at JNS. But anyway, thank you so much, Melanie, for joining us today. Where can our audience purchase your new book and follow your work other than on JNS?
Well, hurrah for JNS, and thank you, Jonathan, for stewarding it so ably. People can find my new book, Fighting the Hate, a handbook for Jews under siege. You can only find it, I'm afraid, on Amazon. It's published by Wicked Sun in America, but it's available only through Amazon outlets. And you can find my other book, my previous book, The Builder's Stone, How Jews and Christians Built the West and Why Only They Can Save It. It was published last year, again by Wicked Sun. You can find that on Amazon too. And for all my work, my blogs, my articles, you can find it all on my website, which is melaniephillips.substack.com.
Yes, and I do recommend that people subscribe to your Substack. I know I do. It's a great resource. Well, very true. Now, one programming note for our audience: we'll be off the next 2 weeks for Passover, and we'll return with our next show being available on April 16th. We also want to thank our audience. Please remember to tune in every day for Jonathan Tobin Daily Edition, which you can hear wherever you get your podcasts. And whether you're listening to us on any one of them, or watching us live on Facebook or X, or on the JNS YouTube channel, please like and or subscribe to JNS. Click on the bell for notifications and give us good reviews. Please write to us at thinktwice@jns.org and let us know where you listen or watch the show and what you think about it. I want to wish all of you a very happy Passover, Chag Pesach Sameach, and remember, keep reading, and thinking for yourself. And we'll see you again next week.